Sometimes the brushes Photoshop automatically comes with aren't set exactly the way you need them, and I will give you the most perfect example that there is. In your brush preset panel, click and grab I believe it's the second one down from the top. It looks like it's called hard round. If you hover over it, that name will show up. And then enlarge the brush to about 60 pixels by either entering that value in here or changing the slider. Make sure you have a color that contrasts with your background, and then click and drag. Now you'll notice it says hard round and it looks like it should create a smooth edge, but if I zoom in here and take a closer look, it's actually got a really bumpy edge. It looks sort of like a earthworm ringing along there, which is not what I want a smooth hard brush to look like. So here's where we can change the qualities and characteristics of that brush. We need the brush panel, which you can always get by going to Window and choosing Brush. It is also accessible anywhere there's this little icon of a can with some brushes hanging out of the top of it. The painting workspace has it automatically set up here. You can also click on it when it's up here in the brush tool control bar. So any of those locations. And here's what we're looking at. It will again preview the brush that you currently have selected, and here I can see the same raggedy edge that I had noticed when I was painting with it. All of these are settings, some of them familiar, such as size and hardness, but here's a new one you haven't seen yet, and it's called spacing. The way that Photoshop Brush works is it takes the shape of the tip and will stamp it essentially numerous times along the flow of motion when you click and drag, and depending on how many times it stamps it, it will appear either smooth or kind of rough. So with spacing, if we grab this and, for example, take it all the way to the right, it increases the space between each one of those stamps, and that is where those edges are coming from. It's actually a round circle that's getting stamped so that it sort of overlaps each other, but not to the point that those disappear. So yes, you actually can drag this out so far that when you click and drag you have kind of a dot brush pattern, which is really fun and sometimes comes in useful. But what we want to make is a brush that has a truly smooth edge. So grab this spacing and move it all the way over to the left till it says 1% and there are no raggedy edges along there. And then now when you click and draw, it should be a perfectly smooth line. I will warn you, however, if you have a really old computer or not much processing power at all, you might see Photoshop slow down a little when this setting is on, simply because it's creating many more stamps every time you draw. Most computers anymore are plenty powerful enough to handle this, so we won't linger on that for longer than just the moment. However, now we've got new qualities for this brush. If I click off of this brush and choose another one here in my bar and then click back to this one that I was originally on, you'll notice those settings I changed are gone. The only way I can preserve those settings is to save a new brush preset. So if you've done like I did and clicked off and now just on to that hard round brush, let's set the spacing back down at 1% and create a new brush preset. To do this, you go to the top right of the panel, click on the drop down and choose New Brush Preset. It will ask you to name it. It's always a good idea to give a descriptive name of what this brush is, so I'm going to say it's a hard, smooth round. The size that it was when I saved this was 75 pixels. But because this is one of Photoshop's basic round brushes, I can actually make it any amount bigger or smaller and it will still retain all of the image quality that I need it to have. It has now been logged down at the bottom of my brush presets, and in fact if I hover over it, it will show me the name that I gave it, so hard, smooth, round. That's a really useful thing to be able to do, is to adjust the brush settings that you have in here. So I'm going to give you another example of something I do all the time. If I scroll up here in my brush panel and choose one of these kind of speckly looking brushes, I'll grab the largest one here, which is a 59. This brush if I click once, looks like a little spotted cloud. If I click and drag, it gives me sort of these brush stroke edges, like I had maybe a rough painting brush and I was dragging that around. Sometimes I do want that effect, but it's more enjoyable sometimes for me to paint with something with a little more texture to it, so I can come in here and change a bunch of the different things for this brush. Let's leave spacing where it is, but do something like change the angle and the width. To do that, you can click here in this little box that has the circle, click by the arrow, and you can tilt it, and now that brush is set to a different angle, and I can affect the width by grabbing this little dot circle and moving it in. So now I have almost more of a flat calligraphy style brush. I can change any of the other settings for this brush by clicking on one of these options here to the left. Currently I am on the brush tip shape part of this panel, and if I click on the next word down, shape dynamics, I'll see all of my controls over here change, as well as this becoming checked. When I want to go back to looking at my brush tip shape, I need to only click up here. However, something to point out about these menus is to see these controls change, you actually have to click on the menu item itself. Just checking the box won't change the controls, but if you click on the menu item, it will change. Let me introduce you to the basic slider structure for all of these. Many of these settings have a word and then it says jitter. Jitter simply means that it will randomize that setting to a greater and greater extent. So you'll notice with this brush that we just painted with is it has some weird affecting or artifacting as it's drawn along, and one way to change that is to shake up the angle or the size or something so that it's not exactly, all those dots aren't in exactly the same spot as we're brushing and drawing. Now that might not make much sense, but I'll show you what I mean. If you click on the size jitter and increase it just a little bit and watch your little preview down here, you'll notice that those streaky parts off to the side have changed a little bit, and now if I click and draw, it has a slightly different appearance, and the more that I crank that up, the greater that difference will be until I have almost a completely new quality of brush. Okay, so I'm going to clear all this off by hitting Command A and then delete, and since I'm on a layer above my background, that'll just remove everything from that layer. There's some really fun things to play with in each one of these, and I don't want to take all your time and go through all of them, but I will point out a few things. If you're using a pressure sensitive tablet, you can set these controls to be affected by the pen pressure or pen tilt, or even the stylus wheel if you have a tablet that has a stylus wheel. When those options are on, the pen will affect them. So I'm going to give you just a quick example here as I grab my tablet and put it upside down on my lap. Here we go. So now I'm using very light pressure with my tablet, and when I push harder, there's even more jitter. So that is being controlled by the pen pressure. Mostly what will set to be controlled by the pen is the flow, the opacity, and the size. So I'm just trying to show you that this is just another setting that you can have even more fun with if you have a tablet with which to have fun with. The people that use mice, which in this case is probably most of my students, these two aren't going to matter at all. So let's try out one of these other ones, such as fade. Fade will do this. If you click and drag, you'll notice that the brush paint stops abruptly. That means it just fades out fast, and you can reduce the amount that it fades here in this box. So I'm going to say this 60 and see what the difference is. So now it's further. I will admit, I really haven't had a need for this setting, but I do know some people that use it a lot. Mostly I'll just leave that off if I don't actually have a pen or a need for the fade. Minimum diameter will control how small these stamp widths are. So remember how I said this is like a single brush that gets stamped multiple times along a line? It's still doing that. So when we increase the size jitter, what it's really doing is saying, okay, well, when I stamp once, it'll be really small, and the next time I stamp, it'll be big. To illustrate that even more clearly, if I go back to my brush tip shape and increase the spacing, you'll be able to see exactly what I'm talking about. So each one of these is a single impression of that stamp, and this one's smaller and this one's bigger. So to see the effects of the things we do here for the next minute, let's leave spacing maybe about 30% and come back to shape dynamics. Minimum diameter affects how small the smallest one will be. Angle jitter is just that. It will change the angle up for each stamp impression. So I can set that to be a jitter, which will tell it to be random. The other thing that's really useful for angle is I can set it to be the direction setting. Before I do that, let me show you what this is currently doing. If I click and drag and make an S, all of these impressions are at the exact same angle. So it becomes sort of like a calligraphy brush. If you were holding it firmly and not moving your fingers around, it would stay at the same angle. However, if you change this angle control to direction, it will actually rotate that brush to follow the direction that you're painting in. You see the difference? So jitter makes it random. The control drop down can change a number of values about it. Changing it to be directional is probably the option that I use the most. Roundness jitter, so again a jitter option. The flip X and flip Y means that it will change some of these every now and again, and this is not the brush to make it most obvious, but it will take some of those stamp impressions and flip them vertically or flip them horizontally. At any time you say, oh, that looks really, really cool, I want to save that brush, be sure you come up here to the new brush preset and save it. Another option that's in here that we use quite a bit when setting up brushes is the transfer setting. So let me clear off my brush mess there, and we'll change up a couple things. First off, I'm going to come back to brush tip shape and move my spacing back down so it's more of a solid line. And then we'll come to the transfer option. Now remember, to make the controls appear, you need to click on the word itself. Transfer is just another word for opacity, and if you're in version 5, I believe, it's probably still called transparency or opacity. They just changed what this was called only a version or two ago. Opacity jitter, same thing. If you crank this up, some of those brush impressions will be more or less transparent. If you change it to be affected by the pen pressure, that's like I showed you in the last tutorial where you could click these options on and off. Flow jitter, very similar to the opacity jitter. This one would be mostly a setting that you'd use, I think, with if you wanted a really random brush or if you were indeed using a tablet. So I'm going to say, you know what, this is good. I want to save this and go to my new brush preset and name this example brush. And click OK. Alright, let's go on to finding out how to make your actual own brush shape completely customized from square one.